back as we continue with Phantom.
Etienne Barry, how quickly it happened. How quickly he changed from the urbane young doctor who greeted me with such studied civility every Sunday after Mass.
How quickly he became the bright star in my dark and empty sky.
Within a few short weeks, it seemed to me that I thought of nothing but him, and the time that was measured by the deadly length of hours which separated our secret assigned nations. For 8 years I had lived like a nun.
Perhaps it was inevitable that I should fall in love with the first handsome man to look at me once more with desire. He knew my history, of course. There was only too many eager to relate the grisly details in the hope of sparing a good-looking young doctor the curse of my kiss. Stubbornly, he ignored the warnings of doom and continued to present himself each Sunday at the end of my pew.
I would place my hand upon his sleeve and sweep down the nave, displaying haughty indifference and defiance to those who watched with disapproval.
He was younger than I, with well-formed, well-sculpted features, and eyes that were inclined to stare with scorn at people he despised. He despised most of Fosterville, dismissing its inhabitants as provincial and bigoted. The few patients he had managed to acquire were soon irritated by his arrogant and rather abrasive manner, and his association with me ensured that he had added no more to his practice. I myself quickly learned to defer his opinions, finding our time together too precious to be wasted in argument. I lived in constant fear that he would abandon what he would refer as this tedious little backwater and return to do research in Paris. His restless intelligence and intolerant impatience were far better suited to the laboratory than the drawing room of a Cornelius patient. It was only a question of time before he came to accept that himself. He was insatiably curious about Erik, asking me deep and probing questions and often making note of my replies. His interest, he assured me, was purely scientific. He wished to build up a case study. Repeatedly he asked to see the child, but that, for many reasons, I would not permit. At the back of my mind, an uneasy feeling was growing that he would not hesitate to pin Erik to a dissecting table in order to satisfy his curiosity.
Madeleine, he chided gently, as I increasingly shied away from his persistent inquiries, you must not be so suspicious of the scientific mind. I thought you trusted me.
I looked away. I was growing to love the man, but I did not trust the scientist.
I feared the lust for knowledge that lurked like a ravening wolf in his cool blue eyes.
Rising from the sofa, I walked away to the window, staring out the village green and the old church which towered to the sky just beyond.
You asked too many questions, I murmured. Of course. He tossed the notebook aside and came beside me, throwing off the impersonal clinical manner like a soiled apron. Insatiable curiosity is not a very attractive quality, I'm afraid.
Forgive me, Madeleine. His hand was insistent on my arm, but I did not look at him.
Sometimes I think all you want from me is answers. I sighed. He turned
me slowly until I faced him. Not at all, he said, and kissed me. Who is that man? Erik demanded abruptly. He was waiting for me in the hall as I let myself in the house, and there was a hard, accusing look in his eyes as he stared at me.
Who is that man?
He repeated stonily when I failed to answer. Why does he walk with you alone? It was almost 4 months since I had first met Etienne, but I've been very careful that Erik should not see us together. Obviously tonight I had not been careful enough. If I choose to walk with a man, it is no concern of yours, I retorted angrily. Hanging up my cloak, I made to walk past him, but he blocked my path to the drawing room, and I suddenly knew I had a moment of intense fear. He stood as high as my shoulder, and I was deceptively strong in spite of a skeletal frame. Who is he, Mother? It was the first time he ever used the word to address me, and the contempt in his voice was quite terrifying. His name is Etienne, I found myself saying breathlessly. Etienne Barwier. He is a doctor. Now let me pass, Erik. I will not be questioned in this tiresome and impertinent manner. My voice wavered to a halt as he continued to stare at me coldly. He's a friend, I stammered. You must understand, Erik. I have a perfect right to have friends like everyone else in the village. He made a movement toward me, and instinctively I took a defensive step back. I do not wish this friendship to continue, he told me inexorably. The eyes behind the mask were like gimlets. I had never seen them look like that at me before. I retreated down the hall until I felt my back against the door, but still he advanced toward me with curious, unchildlike menace. I struck out at him in sudden fear, but after that first hesitant blow, rage overwhelmed my apprehension at his unspoken threat. You, I screamed, you do not wish? How dare you speak to me like this? You ruined my life since the day we were born. Ruined it, ruined it. I hate you. I hate the very sight and sound of you. Your devil's face and your angel's voice. There are plenty of angels in hell, do you know that? I wish to God you were there with them, where you belong. I wish you were dead, you hear me? I wish you were dead. He seemed to shrink, almost to shrivel in front of my eyes. Whatever he might have been a few seconds before, he was only a child now, recoiling in disbelief from a punishment beyond his worst imagination. It was as though all the ugly emotion that had been festering between us since birth had erupted into a single massive boil and finally burst, drowning us both in its poison. And I knew, as I looked at his crushed misery, that he would carry those words with him to the grave. Nothing I could say or do now would ever wash their corrosive stain from his mind. As I hovered beside him, unable to express my grief or remorse, he suddenly took his hands away from the mask and stared at me with a wretchedness that was beyond tears. I hate you too, he said with a slow, pained surprise, as though it was something that had only now been revealed to him. I hate you too. And turning away from me, he groped his way slowly up the staircase like a blind child. Erik did not speak of the man again. From that time he displayed complete indifference to my increasing absences, not even bothering to look up when I returned to the house. He wrapped around himself a cloak of inevitable silence and spoke most of the time working alone in his room, with only Sasha for company. The dog was growing old and obese, entering that period of rapid decline which besets so many canines around their 10th year. Erik carried her patiently up and down the steep stairs that were now beyond her, bathed her rheumy eyes, and sometimes sat for an hour at a time feeding her by hand. But I was not convinced he understood that the inevitable moment of parting might be close at hand, and since it was nothing I could comfortably discuss with him, I asked Father Manzart to raise the subject instead. Their quiet voices were only audible to me in the next room while I sat sewing. Yes, said Erik calmly. He knew that Sasha was old and would not live forever, perhaps not live beyond the next year or so. He understood that God would take her to live in heaven, and that they would not be separated forever. I felt, rather than heard, the priest quick and take a breath. The breath he had taken to correct his pupil's childish but unacceptable error in doctrine. He asked Erik to understand, though God had compassion for all his creatures, it was man alone that he had granted an afterlife. Animals, said Father Manzart solemnly, have no souls. There was a heartbeat of silence, and then, without warning, a scream of indescribable grief and rage, which seemed to rip up my head apart. I rushed into the drawing room in time to see Erik seize the clock from the mantelpiece and smash it from the hearth. And then, to my absolute horror, he picked up the coal tongs and lashed out at the priest, shrieking terrible obscenities, words I didn't think he even knew. When I tried to get between him, the tongs caught me with full force on my shoulder, slicing clean through the velvet into the flesh. The priest dragged me back out of the rage of the wildly flailing weapon, which was hacked in my God, I breathed. He will wreck anything in the room. Let me stop him. Father Mansard's answer was to pull me through the door, shutting it hastily behind him. A savage barrage of blows struck the panels in our way, and our door began to splinter. As I caught the handle, the priest snatched my hand away. You must not approach him. He does not know you. I stared at him in disbelief. The sounds of a friendly destructive continued in the room beyond. The priest's face was deathly pale. His lips set in a gray line of pain and grief. I have failed, he muttered wearily. I have failed him and I have failed God. I don't understand you, I asked. Are you telling me he is mad? The priest shook his head grimly. This is not madness, child. This is possession. If you go to him now, he will kill you. We must wait until whatever demon has him now in its grip grows tired of its sword and departs. I looked at the blood soaking steadily in my sleeve. Will it happen again? I stammered uncertainly. The priest sighed. Once a suitable host presents itself to the forces of darkness, he spreads his hand in a helpless gesture before continuing. Tomorrow, I will perform the ceremony of exorcism, he said unhappily. Exorcism. Blackness closed in around me, and Father Mansard caught me as I swayed. Exorcism, said Etienne in disgust. The priest is a stupid meddler who belonged properly in the Middle Ages. This is not the case for the church, but for a medical institution. An asylum, I muttered. You mean an asylum for the insane? Etienne sighed. I wish you would not resort to such emotive terms. The child appears to suffer from a degree of mental disturbance, which under circumstances is really no more than what I expect to find. There are a few more hazardous to the equilibrium of the human mind than the freakish genius you have described to me. He placed one hand upon my arm before adding quietly, My darling, you must really begin to give serious thought to the question of an institution. But they are terrible places, are they not? One hears such dreadful tales of cruelty. By no means, replied Etienne calmly. Some are better than others, I won't deny that, but I happen to know of an excellent place where he'd be kept out of harm's way. He could have his own books and music. He'd be quite happy, or at least as happy as he ever likely to be on this earth. Etienne leaned back on the river bank and watched the sun flow past through the half-closed eyes. He had a brisk, uncompromising manner of dealing with emotion, a manner that negated both passion and sentiment. His boundless optimism was capable of cloaking the most unpleasant proposals in a respectable, acceptable garb. A quick decision, a decision upon the committal papers, and all my problems would be over. He made it sound so easy and so right. Leaning over, he pressed me back against the Tasaki grasp, and I was able to surrender his insistent lip. It meant that I did not have to think, to argue with myself. For a few blissful moments, there was only a physical delight and a spiritual release, and I pulled him closer, fearing the moment that he would draw away. 10 years ago, I did not believe that I would have loved him. For 10 years, I could not have been born to be told what to think, what to do in such a cavalier fashion. Now there was nothing I wanted so much to be safely locked in his arms and sheltered from the ugliness of reality. We were lovers in all but the fullest sense. For me, he was too logical, too rational, too sensible, to the risk of ruining it for me. He craved a respectable existence, in keeping with the dignity of his profession. I knew that these hole in the corner assignations were likely to pale in time. Not reasonably, he wanted some promise of a future. But what future could there be when I dare not even invite him for dinner for fear of provoking Erik's violent rage?
I knew the state of affairs could not continue indefinitely, and there was already a soft-footed intruder whispering with insidious determination at the back of my mind, telling me now what I think I know from the very first moment in the name of the church.
This man would marry you
If you were free,
if I were free of my misbegotten child, if I put him in an institution for the violently insane.
I was very quiet as we walked back along the riverbank, and long before we came to the side of the village, I suggested it would be wiser for me to continue alone. People are beginning to talk. In your position, you cannot afford a scandal. He put one arm around my shoulders and tilted my face up to his. Madeleine, he said gently, there doesn't have to be a scandal. You know that, don't you? All that I'm asking is that you let me examine the boy and give you my professional judgment on his mental state. But I knew that judgment had already been made, and desperate as I was not yet ready to play Judas.
You will think about what I have said, he insisted.
Yes, I said dully, I will think about it, but I knew I would not. Okay, thanks for listening. That's all right now.